The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the Red Rock Cemetery as they lowered Nathaniel Thorne into the hard ground. No flowers adorned the simple pine coffin, no music accompanied his descent. Just the whispered prayers of a weary preacher and the silent tears of his 35-year-old widow Elena standing rigid as iron beside their 14-year-old daughter Willa. The mourners had barely begun to disperse when Colonel Victor Ashford approached, his polished boots crunching on the parched earth. He was a man who wore silk ties in a frontier town, a man whose very presence made honest folk look away. Mrs. Thorne, his voice carried the smoothness of someone who'd never had to raise it. Tragic about Nathaniel, truly tragic. He withdrew a folded document from his coat. But the bank has obligations, 30 days to settle the debt, $5,000, or the property transfers to us. Elena's hand tightened around her daughter's shoulder. She didn't look at Ashford. Her eyes remained fixed on the fresh mound of dirt that held her husband. Sheriff says it was an accident, Ashford continued, tipping his hat. Horse through him. Terrible way to go. But Elena had seen the bruises on Nate's wrists. She'd found the torn page from his journal hastily hidden in their bedroom. 3 words scrawled in his hand, Crawford wasn't first. And somewhere in the distance, Nate's border collie Flint began to howl toward the Red Canyon walls. What the dog knew would cost them everything, or save them all. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the Red Rock Cemetery
This is how they
as they
plan to
lowered
take the Red
Nathaniel
Canyon
Thorne
land.
into the hard ground. No flowers
I
adorned the
have to
simple
stop
pine
them.
coffin. No music accompanied his descent. Just the whispered prayers of a weary preacher and the silent tears of his 35-year-old widow Elena standing rigid as iron beside their 14-year-old daughter Willa. The mourners had barely begun to disperse when Colonel Victor Ashford approached, his polished boots crunching on the parched earth. He was a man who wore silk ties in a frontier town, a man whose very presence made honest folk look away. Mrs. Thorne, his voice carried the smoothness of someone who'd never had to raise it. Tragic about Nathaniel, truly tragic. He withdrew a folded document from his coat. But the bank has obligations, 30 days to settle the debt, $5,000, or the property transfers to us. Elena's hand tightened around her daughter's shoulder. She didn't look at Ashford. Her eyes remained fixed on the fresh mound of dirt that held her husband. Sheriff says it was an accident, Ashford continued, tipping his hat. Horse through him. Terrible way to go. But Elena had seen the bruises on Nate's wrists. She'd found the torn page from his journal hastily hidden in their bedroom. 3 words scrawled in his hand, Crawford wasn't first. And somewhere in the distance, Nate's border collie Flint began to howl toward the Red Canyon walls. The thing about grief is that it doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in waves, each one threatening to pull you under. But Elena Thorne had been a school teacher for 12 years before she married Nate. She knew how to breathe through panic. She knew how to keep her spine straight when the world wanted to bend her double. That night after Willa finally cried herself to sleep, Elena sat at the kitchen table with a kerosene lamp and every paper Nate had left behind. The ranch ledgers, the deed with the bank stamp, the letters he'd received from the land office, and hidden between the pages of his Bible folded so carefully it might have been sacred, that torn journal page. Crawford wasn't first, but Samuel Crawford. The name meant something. Elena closed her eyes and reached back through 8 years of living in Red Rock, through church socials and town meetings and conversations overheard at the general store. Crawford, the rancher who disappeared in 1883, the one everyone said had run off to California, abandoning his spread and his debts. His wife had left town 6 months later, hollow-eyed and silent. Elena spread the deed across the table. Their property bordered the Red Canyon to the north. Crawford's old place had been 3 miles west, also bordering the canyon. She thought about the bruises on Nate's wrists, the way his hands had been positioned when they found him folded across his chest like someone had arranged him. The horse grazing calmly 200 yards away, not spooked, not injured, just standing there like it had been waiting. Horses don't wait when their riders fall. Elena pulled
Please
another
have a
lamp
seat.
closer and began to search through Nate's things with the
Thank you.
methodical precision of a
I
woman
think this
who
evidence
understands
regarding
the
the
answers
property
hide
line
in
is relevant.
details.
Look
In the bottom
closely
drawer
at
of his
page
desk,
32.
beneath a stack of old newspapers, she found
God.
it. A leather-bound
He signed
notebook,
this the day
small
before he
enough to fit
died.
in a saddlebag.
The
pages
bruises
worn from
confirm
months
what we
of handling.
suspected.
Her hands trembled as she
7
opened
men
it.
are dead,
The first
Harlow, and
entry
it's
was
because
dated
of that
January
illegal mine.
1891, 8 months before he died. Ran into Henry Walsh's
We
widow at
must
church.
go to the
She asked if
canyon.
I'd noticed anything strange about the
Ashford is
land
destroying the
transfers.
evidence
Said
right
Henry
now.
was convinced something wasn't right about the bank's foreclosure terms. He died 2 weeks before the case could be reviewed. Heart attack, they said. But Henry was 41 and strong as an ox. Elena turned the page, and the next, and the next. What she found was a chronicle of death. Henry Walsh, 1884. Heart attack at 41. Robert Jensen, 1885. Shot during an alleged robbery that no one witnessed. Abraham Fletcher, 1887. Drowned in a river where the water barely reached a man's waist. Franklin Butler, 1888. Found hanged in his barn. Ruled a suicide, though he told his wife the night before that he was going to Santa Fe to file a complaint against the bank. Theodore Green, 1890. Bitten by a rattlesnake in his own bedroom, his wife swore she'd never seen a snake inside the house in 20 years of marriage. And Samuel Crawford, 1883. Disappeared, never found. 7 men, 8 years. All of them owned land near Red Canyon. All of them had taken loans from Victor Ashford's bank.
It wasn't an
All of
accident.
them dead or vanished before they could challenge
These iron
the
tool
foreclosures.
marks prove the
Nate's
rock fall
handwriting
is
grew
fake.
smaller, more urgent as the entries continued. I rode out to the canyon today. There's something they're hiding up there. Mining equipment, recent tracks. But the land belongs to the territory, not to private owners. No legal claims have been filed. I need to find out what they're pulling from that canyon. Saw Ashford meeting with Sheriff Dawson behind the bank after dark. They didn't see me. Heard Dawson say, just like Butler. Heard Ashford say, make it clean. Found the old claim maps at the land office.
They're
The
all
canyon
here.
sits on top of a silver vein. Survey from 1878 estimated it could be worth millions. But it was designated public land, no mining rights issued. Someone is working that vein illegally. The last entry was dated 3 days before Nate died. I found it. A cave in the north wall of the canyon hidden behind a rock fall that looks natural but isn't. Inside there are crates, documents, evidence of everything. I'm going back tomorrow with enough supplies to catalog it all. If something happens to me, Flint knows the way. Tell Elena to trust the dog. And tell her to find Judge Harlow. He's the only man in this territory Ashford hasn't bought. Elena closed the notebook and sat in the darkness of her kitchen listening to the clock tick on the wall. Somewhere in the next room, Willa whimpered in her sleep, still dreaming of her father. 3 days after that final entry, Nate was dead. Not an accident, murder. And now Victor Ashford wanted her land.
The projections in this report are significant, but look at the density here.
Exactly. This deposit goes much deeper than anticipated.
She walked to the cabinet where Nate had kept his Colt 45 and took it down from the high shelf. The weight of it surprised her. She never held a gun in her life, never wanted to. She set it on the table beside the notebook. Then she walked to Willa's room, sat on the edge of her daughter's bed and smoothed the hair back from the girl's forehead. Willa stirred but didn't wake. At 14, she had Nate's dark eyes and Elena's stubborn chin. She'd cried for 3 days straight. Now her face looked older than it had a week ago. I'm going to find out what happened to your father, Elena whispered. And I'm going to make sure the man who killed him pays for it. She said it like a prayer, like an oath, like a declaration of war. The next morning, Elena left Willa with Mrs. Henderson,
Hurry,
the
we
widow
need to
who
get
lived
these
a mile
organized
down the
before
road
dawn.
and rode into town. She told no
Did
one
you
where
find
she
the
was
map
going,
in that crate
told
yet?
no one what she
No,
found.
keep looking. It has to be
In a
here.
place like Red Rock, where Victor Ashford owned the bank and the sheriff and half the town, council information was more dangerous than dynamite. Judge Ezekiel Harlow
Quickly,
lived in
slide
a
it in.
two-story
Now the
house on the
boards.
edge of
Almost
town,
there.
set back from the road behind a fence of weathered wood. He was
Footsteps.
72 years
Someone's
old,
coming.
a circuit judge who'd retired 5 years earlier after a stroke left his left hand weak and his patience for political games weaker still. He'd been a friend of Elena's father back when her father was still alive and practicing law in Tucson. When Elena knocked on his door, he answered with a book in his good hand and suspicion in his pale blue eyes. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, "I'm sorry about Nathaniel. He was a good man." "He was murdered," Elena said, "and I can prove it." Harlow studied her face for a long moment, then he stepped aside and gestured her into the house. His study smelled of pipe smoke and old leather. Books lined every wall, floor to ceiling, the accumulated wisdom of a man who had spent 50 years interpreting the law. Harlow cleared a chair for her and sat down behind his desk with the careful movements of someone whose body no longer obeyed him the way it once had. "Tell me," he said. So she did. She told him about the bruises on Nate's wrists, about the journal hidden in the Bible, about the 7 names and the pattern of death stretching back 8 years, about the cave in the canyon and the illegal silver mine. When she finished, Harlow was silent for a long time. He stared at his hands, at the fingers that trembled slightly even when he tried to hold them still. "I knew something was wrong," he said finally. "I've watched Victor Ashford acquire half the land in this county over the past 8 years, and every time I asked how he managed to do it so quickly, so cheaply, I got the same answer. Foreclosures, legal and proper. But foreclosures don't usually result in the borrower dying before the ink dries on the transfer papers." He looked up at Elena. "Your husband came to see me 3 days before he died. He told me he'd found evidence, said he needed advice on how to present it so that it couldn't be buried or ignored. I told him to go to the U.S. Marshal in Tucson, federal jurisdiction. Ashford's influence doesn't reach that far." "Why didn't he go?" "He said he needed to secure the evidence first, document everything. He was afraid that if Ashford found out what he knew, the cave would be emptied and burned before anyone official could see it." Elena leaned forward. "Then we have to go there, now, before Ashford realizes that Nate wrote it all down." Harlow raised an eyebrow. "You said my father was your friend. You said Nate was a good man. If you meant those things, then yes, Harlow studied her again with those sharp blue eyes that age hadn't dulled. Then slowly he nodded. "I'll get my coat." They rode out together before dawn the next morning, Elena on Nate's horse and Harlow on a sturdy roan that moved at the careful pace of a mount accustomed to an elderly rider. Willa came with them. Elena had tried to make her stay, but the girl had looked at her mother with eyes that were no longer a child's. "He was my father," Willa said. "I'm coming," so she came. And Flint came too, trotting ahead of them with the easy confidence of a dog that knew exactly where he was going. The canyon opened up before them like a wound in the earth, red rock walls rising 200 feet on either side. The morning sun hadn't yet reached the bottom, and the shadows lay thick and cool across the narrow trail. Flint moved faster now, his black and white coat disappearing and reappearing as he wove between the boulders. "How does the dog know?" Harlow asked. "Nate must have taken him," Elena said, "multiple times. Dogs remember." They followed Flint for nearly an hour, deeper into the canyon than Elena had ever been. The walls closed in until they were riding single file, the horses' hooves echoing off the stone. Then Flint stopped. He sat down in front of what looked like a solid wall of rock and rubble, the remnants of an old landslide. But when Elena dismounted and walked closer, she could see what the casual eye would miss. A gap, narrow, hidden behind a boulder that looked natural, but when she examined it closely showed marks of iron tools. "It's been moved," she said, "recently. Look at the scrapes in the dirt." Harlow climbed down from his horse with a grunt. "Can we get through?" Elena tied her horse to a twisted juniper and squeezed through the gap. It was tight to the rock, scraping her shoulders, but she made it through. On the other side, the passage widened into a cavern that smelled of dust and time and something mineral that that she couldn't name. "Hand me a torch," she called back. Harlow passed one through. Elena struck a match and light flared in the darkness. What she saw made her breath catch. The cabin was larger than she had expected, the ceiling high enough to stand in comfortably. And against the far wall, stacked with military precision, were 8 wooden crates reinforced with iron bands. Elena moved closer. The first crate was unlocked. She lifted the lid. Documents, hundreds of them, deeds, contracts, letters, all organized with the careful attention of someone who understood that chaos was the enemy of proof. She pulled out the first deed and held it up to the torchlight. The property description matched Samuel Crawford's old ranch. The signature at the bottom read Victor Ashford as administrator of foreclosed properties. But beneath that signature in fainter ink, she could see where another name had been, the original owner's name. It had been erased and written over. Forgery. She opened the second crate. More deeds, dozens of them, all with the same telltale signs of alteration. Names changed, dates modified. Witnesses who couldn't possibly have been present because the dates didn't match the public records. The third crate held correspondence. Letters between Victor Ashford and Sheriff Dawson. Letters between Ashford and 3 different members of the territorial legislature. The language was carefully neutral, the kind of phrasing that could mean anything to a casual reader. But Elena had been a teacher. She knew how to read between lines. One letter dated 1884 made her hands shake. "The Walsh matter has been resolved." Dawson handled it with his usual efficiency. "The property transfers next week. I am confident there will be no further complications." Resolved. That was the word Ashford had used for a man's death. She set the letter aside and opened the fourth crate. Ledgers, financial records, columns of numbers that showed money moving from the bank to private accounts. Money that should have been used to cover depositors' funds, instead being diverted to purchase mining equipment, to pay off officials, to hire men whose names appeared with dollar amounts beside them and no explanation of services rendered. The fifth and sixth crates contained more of the same. A paper trail of corruption so extensive, so meticulous that Elena knew immediately why Nate had been killed. This wasn't just fraud, this was an empire built on stolen land and murdered men. The seventh crate held geological surveys and mining reports. The silver vein ran for 3 miles beneath the canyon. One report estimated conservative value $12 million, and every ounce of it was being extracted illegally from public land, sold through shell companies, and laundered through Ashford's bank. Elena opened the 8th crate and found herself looking at 3 skulls. She jerked back, nearly dropping the torch. Harlow, who had finally squeezed through the gap and joined her in the cavern, moved to her side. "Dear God," he breathed. The bones were all yellowed with time. Beside each skull lay personal effects, a pocket watch engraved with the initials SC, a wedding ring too small for a man's hand, probably worn on a chain, a military medal from the war between the states. "Crawford," Elena said, pointing to the pocket watch. "Henry Walsh." She indicated the ring. "And this has to be Robert Jensen. He was a captain in the Union Army. His widow told me once that he never took off his medal." "Ashford kept them," Harlow said quietly, "like trophies." "No, not trophies. Evidence. Insurance. The kind of thing a careful man would keep in case he needed leverage, in case one of his accomplices got nervous, or greedy, or moral." Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a cold clarity that burned away the fog of grief. This was what Nate had found, this was what had gotten him killed, and now she had it. "We need to document everything," she said, "every paper, every letter. We need to create an inventory so detailed that Ashford can't claim any of this is fabricated." "That will take days," Harlow said. "Then we work fast." They did. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening by torchlight, and then by the small lantern Harlow had brought in his saddlebag. Willa helped her young eyes and steady hands, proving invaluable as they sorted documents by date and type. They created lists, cross references, an index that showed which deed corresponded to which letter implicated which official. Flint lay by the entrance, patient and watchful. By midnight, they had filled 2 notebooks with inventory. Every crate, every document, every piece of evidence catalogued with the precision of a legal filing. We need to move these, Elena said, all of them to Tucson. That's 120 miles, Harlow said, with 8 heavy crates. We'll need a wagon, supplies, and we'll need to do it without anyone in Red Rock knowing what we're doing. I have a wagon, Elena said, and I can be packed and ready to leave by tomorrow night. Victor Ashford will know the moment you load a wagon and head east. Then we leave before dawn, before anyone is awake to see. Harlow looked at her with something that might have been admiration or might have been concern. Mrs. Thorne, if Ashford realizes what you're doing, he won't send lawyers. He'll send killers. I know. And you're willing to risk your daughter. Elena thought about Nate's body in the ground, about the 7 other men who died asking questions, about the 63 families, according to the deeds, in those crates who'd lost their land to a man who'd built an empire on murder and lies. If I don't do this, she said, then Nate died for nothing, and Ashford wins. And in 5 years or 10 years, there will be another widow standing in this cave asking herself if she's brave enough to fight back. She looked at Willa, who met her eyes without flinching. We're doing this, Elena said. Tonight we move the crates to my ranch. Tomorrow night we leave for Tucson. And we don't stop until every piece of this evidence is in the hands of someone who can be bought. Harlow was quiet for a long moment, then he nodded. I'll help you load the wagon. They worked through the night. It took 3 trips to move all 8 crates from the cave to Elena's ranch, and by the time the last one was secured in the false bottom of the hay wagon, the eastern sky was starting to lighten. Elena had built that false bottom years ago when Nate was worried about thieves stealing their tools during the trip to the winter grazing lands. It was deep enough to hold the crates with 2 feet of hay on top. No one looking at the wagon would guess what lay beneath. Harlow went home to gather his own supplies and to write a letter to Marshal Tobias Crane in Tucson. The letter would go out on the noon stage, giving Crane advance warning that they were coming and why. Elena sent Willa to pack their things: clothes, food, water for 3 days, the Colt 45, and a box of ammunition. Then she stood in her kitchen in the house she'd shared with Nate for 10 years and allowed herself one moment of doubt. What if they didn't make it? What if Ashford caught them on the road? What if she was leading her daughter into the same death that had taken her husband? But then she thought about the 7 names in Nate's journal, the 3 skulls in the cave, the 63 deeds marked with forgery and blood. And she thought about Willa growing up in a world where men like Victor Ashford could kill with impunity because no one was brave enough to stand against them. No, she wouldn't let her daughter inherit that world. Elena picked up the Colt, checked the cylinder the way Nate had shown her once years ago, and slid it into the pocket of her coat. Then she walked outside to where Willa stood beside the loaded wagon, Flint at her feet. Ready? Elena asked. Willa nodded. Ready. They were about to climb up when the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the road. Fast. Multiple horses. Elena's hand went to the gun in her pocket. Willa pressed close to her mother's side. Flint's hackles rose, a low growl rumbling in his chest. 6 riders came around the bend. They weren't wearing badges. They weren't dressed like lawmen. They were dressed like the kind of men you hired when you wanted something done and didn't care about the methods. The lead rider pulled up 20 feet from the house. He was a lean man with a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. Mrs. Thorne, he said, Colonel Ashford would like to speak with you about some property that's gone missing from Red Canyon. Elena kept her hand in her pocket, fingers wrapped around the grip of the Colt. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. The man smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. That's why you're loading a wagon at 4 in the morning. I'm taking supplies to my sister in Prescott. Funny, Ashford's records say you don't have a sister. Elena said nothing. The men dismounted. So did two of the others. They spread out casual and confident the way wolves spread out when they've cornered prey. Here's how this is going to work, the scarred man said. You're going to tell us where those crates are. We're going to take them. And then we're going to forget we ever saw you. Simple. And if I don't... The man's hand drifted toward his gun. Then we stop being polite. Elena pulled the Colt from her pocket and pointed it at the scarred man's chest. Her hand didn't shake, not even a little. Get off my property, the man laughed. Lady, you ever even fired that thing? No, Elena said, but my husband taught me how. And at this distance, even a beginner doesn't miss. The laughter died. The man's eyes narrowed. You really want to do this? I really want you to leave. Now. For a long moment, no one moved. The tension stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Elena kept the gun steady, kept her eyes on the scarred man, and waited. Then a voice cut through the silence. I believe the lady asked you to leave. Judge Harlow rode around the side of the house, a shotgun resting across his saddle. His left hand might have been weak, but his right was steady as stone. This doesn't concern you, old man, the scarred man said. On the contrary, when 6 armed men threaten a widow and her daughter on their own property, it concerns every man with a sense of decency, which apparently excludes you. One of the other riders shifted nervously. We don't want trouble, Judge. Then go back to town and tell Victor Ashford that if he wants to speak to Mrs. Thorne, he can do it through proper legal channels in daylight, with witnesses present. The scarred man spat into the dirt, but he remounted his horse. So did the others. This isn't over, he said to Elena. Yes, she said quietly, it is. They rode away. Elena didn't lower the gun until they were out of sight. Then her hands started to shake and she had to sit down on the wagon step before her legs gave out. Harlow dismounted and stood beside her. They'll be back with more men. Ashford knows you have the crates now. Then we leave immediately. In daylight, they'll see us on the road. Then we go through the canyon, the back way. It'll take longer, but they won't expect it. Harlow considered this. It's rough country. The wagon might not make it. It will make it, Elena said. It has to. She stood, climbed onto the wagon seat, and took up the reins. Willa scrambled up beside her. Flint jumped into the back, settling himself on top of the hay. Harlow mounted his horse. I'll ride ahead, scout the route. They left the ranch without looking back, left the house where Elena had been happy, left the grave where Nate lay buried, left everything that had been their life, because some things were more important than home, some things were worth losing everything to protect. The canyon trail was barely wide enough for the wagon. Elena had to drive slowly, carefully, the wheels sometimes coming within inches of the edge, where the ground dropped away into nothing. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the red rocks into flame. Sweat soaked through her dress despite the autumn chill. Willa didn't speak. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead, one hand gripping the seats, the other resting on Flynn's head. They'd been traveling for 2 hours when Harlow came riding back at a gallop. Company, he said, 4 riders coming up fast from the south. Ashford's men. Who else? Elena looked around. The canyon walls rose steep and unforgiving on both sides. No place to hide, no way to outrun mounted men with a loaded wagon. There's a narrow section ahead, Harlow said. If we can get through it first, we can defend it, but we have to move now. Elena snapped the reins. The horses lurched forward, the wagon creaking and swaying. Behind them, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. They reached the narrow section just as the 4 riders came into view. The passage was barely 10 feet wide, the walls so close that Elena could reach out and touch them on both sides. She drove the wagon through the wheels, scraping rock, and then Harlow was there with his shotgun. Stay in the wagon, he told Elena, no matter what happens. The first rider entered the passage. At a gallop, Harlow fired. The sound was deafening in the confined space. The rider jerked back and fell from his horse. The other 3 pulled up short. Turn around, Harlow shouted. I've got 8 more shells and no reason not to use them. You just killed a man, Judge, one of them called back. He was trespassing on private land with clear intent to harm. That's legal justification in any court in this territory. You want to test whether the same applies to you. There was a long pause. Then slowly the 3 riders turned their horses and rode back the way they'd come. Harlow lowered the shotgun. His hands were shaking now, not from fear, from age, from the effort of holding a heavy weapon steady. We need to keep moving, he said quietly. They did. They drove through the afternoon and into the evening, stopping only to rest the horses and to eat cold food from the packs Willa had prepared. No fire, no unnecessary noise. As darkness fell, they made camp in a small box canyon off the main trail. Elena unhitched the horses and fed them grain while Willa spread bedrolls on the ground. Harlow stood watch at the canyon entrance, shotgun across his knees. Get some sleep, he told Elena. I'll wake you in 4 hours. But Elena couldn't sleep. She lay on her bedroll, staring up at the stars, listening to Willa's breathing slow into sleep and Flint's quiet snoring. She thought about the man Harlow had shot, the first death in this journey toward justice. Would there be more? Almost certainly. Was she prepared for that? She didn't know. What she did know was that she'd crossed the line today. She'd pulled a gun on 6 men. She'd driven into the wilderness with stolen evidence and her daughter and a 72-year-old judge who'd just killed a man to protect them. There was no going back now, no returning to the quiet life of a widow raising her daughter in peace. They would reach Tucson or they would die trying. Those were the only 2 options left. Elena closed her eyes and tried to rest. Tomorrow they would reach the territorial road. Tomorrow they would be exposed, vulnerable, visible to anyone looking for them. Tomorrow the real chase would begin. But tonight, in this small canyon beneath the Arizona stars, she allowed herself to believe that they might actually make it, that justice might actually be possible, that 7 dead men might finally get the truth they died seeking. The territorial road stretched before them like a scar across the desert floor, exposed and unforgiving under the relentless Arizona sun. Elena gripped the reins tighter as the wagon wheels found the packed earth, leaving the relative safety of the canyon behind. Out here, they were visible for miles in every direction. Out here, there was nowhere to hide. How far to Fort Grant? Willa asked, her voice barely audible over the creak of the wagon and the steady rhythm of hooves on hard ground. 20 miles, Harlow said from his horse alongside them. We should reach it by sundown if we keep this pace. Fort Grant meant soldiers. Federal soldiers, men who answered to Washington, not to Victor Ashford. It meant safety, at least temporarily. A place to rest the horses and resupply before the final push to Tucson. But 20 miles was a long way, and Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced back at the canyon mouth, now a dark slash in the red rocks behind them. Nothing moved, no dust plume indicating riders, no glint of sun or metal. Yet the feeling persisted. Flint felt it too. The dog paced restlessly in the wagon bed, his ears swiveling at sounds Elena couldn't hear. Every few minutes he'd stop and stare back the way they'd come, a low rumble building in his chest before falling silent again. Easy, boy, Willa murmured, reaching back to stroke his head. But her eyes, when they met her mother's, were full of the same unease. They'd been on the road for 3 hours when Elena spotted the dust. It rose from the south, a thin brown column against the pale sky. Too much dust for a single rider, too sustained for a dust devil. Harlow, she said quietly. The judge had already seen it. His hand moved to the shotgun strapped to his saddle. Could be a freight wagon, could be cavalry from the fort, could be Ashford's men. Yes. They kept moving. What else could they do? Leaving the road meant rough terrain that would slow them to a crawl. Stopping meant making themselves sitting targets. Their only option was to keep going and hope that whoever raised that dust had business that didn't involve them. The dust grew closer. Elena could make out individual riders now, 5 of them moving fast. Willa, she said calmly, there's a rifle under the seat. Can you reach it without anyone seeing? Her daughter nodded and slipped one hand beneath the wooden bench, finger searching. A moment later, she had it, keeping it low and out of sight. Don't point it at anyone unless I tell you to, Elena said. Understand? Well, yes, Mama. The riders closed the distance with the easy confidence of men who owned the road. When they were close enough, Elena could see they weren't wearing badges or military uniforms. Just range clothes and gun belts and expressions that suggested they'd found exactly what they'd been looking for. The lead rider raised his hand and the group slowed to a walk, spreading out across the road in a line that blocked the way forward. He was younger than the scarred man from yesterday, maybe 30, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that were too intelligent for hired muscle. Mrs. Thorne, he said pleasantly. Quite a ways from home, aren't you? Elena pulled the wagon to a stop. Her right hand stayed visible on the reins. Her left slipped into her coat pocket where the colt waited. We're traveling to visit family in Tucson, she said. Is there a problem? That depends. The man gestured to the wagon bed. Mind if we take a look at what you're hauling? Yes, I do mind. This is my property and you have no legal authority to search it. Legal authority? The man smiled. That's a funny thing to bring up. See, we heard a rumor that some property went missing from Red Canyon, property that belongs to Colonel Ashford. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? I know that the canyon is territorial land, not Ashford's. So anything in it belongs to the territory, not to him. Clever woman, the man smiled in waver. But see, that's not really the issue here. The issue is that Colonel Ashford wants that property back, and he's authorized us to retrieve it by whatever means necessary. Harlow nudged his horse forward. I'm Judge Ezekiel Harlow, retired from the territorial circuit. These women are under my protection, and this wagon is their property. You have no grounds to detain or search them. With respect, Judge, you retired 5 years ago. You don't have any authority anymore. You're just an old man with a shotgun. Old, yes, but the shotgun works just fine. As your friend from yesterday discovered. The pleasant expression finally cracked. That was murder. That was self-defense against armed trespassers. Any court in the territory would agree, just as any court would agree that 5 armed men blocking a public road and threatening travelers constitutes highway robbery. One of the other riders, a thick-shouldered man with a scar across his nose, spat into the dust. This is a waste of time, Colton. Let's just take the wagon. The lead rider, Colton, held up a hand. Easy, Wade. The judge is right about one thing. We start shooting on a public road in broad daylight, and that's going to raise questions we don't want to answer. He turned his attention back to Elena. Tell you what, Mrs. Thorne, you turn that wagon around, head back to Red Rock, and return what you took. We all forget this happened. You keep your land. Your daughter stays safe. Everyone wins. Except the 7 men your employer murdered, Elena said. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. Colton's eyes narrowed. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth, and I have the evidence to prove it. Deeds, letters, financial records, everything your Colonel Ashford has done for the past 8 years documented in his own hand. You're making a mistake. No, the mistake would be turning around. The mistake would be letting my husband's murder go unpunished. The mistake would be teaching my daughter that powerful men can kill with impunity. Elena pulled the colt from her pocket and laid it across her lap, not pointing it, just making it visible. We're going to Tucson, she said quietly. You can let us pass or you can try to stop us, but if you try some off, you are going to die. Maybe all of you. And maybe us too, but that evidence will still exist because I've already sent copies ahead. If we don't arrive in Tucson, Marshall Crane will know exactly why. It was a bluff. She hadn't sent anything ahead, but Colton didn't know that. She watched him calculate. watched him weigh the odds, watched him glance at his men and see the uncertainty in their faces. They'd signed up to intimidate a widow, not to die on a dusty road for a man who paid them $20 a month. Let them pass, Colton said finally. Wade turned on him. What Ashford said, Ashford's not here, I am, and I'm not getting killed over a load of papers. He looked at Elena. But you should know, Mrs. Thorne, once you hand that evidence to the marshal, there's no coming back from it. Ashford will know, and he won't stop with hired men next time. I'm counting on it, Elena said. Colton shook his head slowly, almost admiringly. Then he wheeled his horse around and rode south. After a moment, the others followed. Elena didn't move until they were out of sight. Then she let out a breath as she hadn't realized she'd been holding and slumped forward, suddenly aware that she was shaking. Mama. Willa's hand touched her shoulder. Mama, are you all right? Yes. Elena straightened. Yes, I'm fine. But she wasn't fine. She just stared down 5 armed men with nothing but a bluff and a gun she barely knew how to use. She'd gambled her life and her daughter's life on the hope that they valued their own survival more than Ashford's money, and she'd won this time. We need to keep moving, Harlow said gently, and they might change their minds. Elena snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward and the road stretched ahead once more. Fort Grant appeared on the horizon as the sun touched the western mountains. The adobe walls glowed gold in the failing light, and the American flag snapped in the evening breeze. Elena had never been so grateful to see a military installation in her life. The sentries at the gate were young, barely old enough to grow proper mustaches, but they carried their rifles with the casual competence of men who knew how to use them. State your business, one of them said. We need to rest our horses and resupply, Elena said. We're traveling to Tucson. Is there an inn inside the fort? Settlers got rooms, but civilians usually stay in town. I'd prefer to stay inside the fort tonight if that's permitted. The sentry glanced at Harlow, at the shotgun across his saddle, at Willa's pale face. Whatever he saw there made him nod. You can stable your horses at the quartermaster's. Sutler's place is on the west side of the parade ground. Can't miss it. They drove through the gates into a world that felt impossibly safe after 2 days of looking over their shoulders. Soldiers moved about their business with the unhurried efficiency of garrison life. Somewhere a bugle called evening mess. The normalcy of it all made Elena want to weep. The sutler was a grizzled former sergeant named Murphy who took one look at the exhausted woman and the frightened girl and asked no questions. He gave them a room with 2 beds and a door that locked. Harlow took the room next door. Supper's in an hour, Murphy said. I'll send a boy to fetch you. When he'd gone, Elena sat on the bed and finally allowed herself to feel the weight of the past 2 days. They'd made it this far. Against all odds, they'd made it this far. But Tucson was still 80 miles away. 2 more days on the road. 2 more days of being exposed and vulnerable. Mama. Willa sat beside her. That man today, Colton, he was going to kill us, wasn't he? Elena wanted to lie, wanted to protect her daughter from the truth, but Willa deserved better than lies. Yes, she said, I think he was. But you stopped him. I scared him. That's different. You were brave. I was terrified. Willa leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. Papa would be proud of you. Elena closed her eyes. Nate. God, she missed him, missed his quiet strength and his steady hands and the way he had always known what to do. But Nate was gone, and she was still here, and the work wasn't finished. Get some rest, she told Willa. Tomorrow we leave early, before dawn if we can manage it. They ate dinner in the sutler's common room, a plain meal of beans and salt pork that tasted like heaven after 2 days of cold rations. Harlow joined them, moving stiffly after the long ride. I spoke with the fort commander, he said quietly. I told him we are transporting sensitive documents to the U.S. Marshal in Tucson, asked if he could spare an escort. And he said he can give us 4 troopers as far as the San Pedro river crossing. After that, we're on our own, but it's something. It's everything, Elena said. Thank you. They were finishing their meal when a commotion erupted near the fort gates. Raised voices, the sound of horses. Elena's hand moved instinctively toward the pocket where she kept the Colt. A moment later, Murphy appeared in the doorway. His face was grim. "Mrs. Thorne, there's a man at the gate asking for you. Says he's a deputy U.S. Marshal. Name's Colton Reed." The name hit Elena like cold water. Colton. The man from the road. But he'd said he was hired by Ashford. Not a lawman, unless he was both. Unless that's how Ashford had stayed ahead of every investigation. He had a federal badge on his payroll. "Tell him I'm not here," Elena said. "Ma'am, he's got a badge. If he's a federal officer, then he'll have paperwork, proper documentation of his authority. Ask to see it." Murphy hesitated, then nodded and disappeared. Elena turned to Harlow. "We need to leave now. In the dark, the road. If that man is really a deputy marshal, he can commandeer our wagon, and if he's lying, he'll wait until morning and ambush us on the road. Either way, we can't stay here." Harlow saw the logic immediately. "I'll get the horses." They moved fast. Willa gathered their few belongings while Elena threw coins on the table to cover their meal. By the time Murphy returned, they were already heading for the stables. Mrs. Thorne waited. But they didn't wait. They hitched the horses in record time, climbed aboard the wagon, and drove toward the rear gate that led to the corrals and training grounds. The sentry there tried to stop them. "Ma'am, you can't leave that way." "We're delivering a message to the quartermaster," Harlow said with the absolute authority of a man who'd spent 50 years making people believe him. "Official business. Open the gate." The sentry flustered and uncertain did. They rode out into the darkness of the Arizona night with no torch, no lantern, nothing but starlight to guide them. Behind them, shouts echoed from the fort. Someone had realized they were gone. "Can you see the road?" Willa asked. "Barely," Elena said, but she kept the horses moving forward, trusting them to find the way, trusting that the darkness that made travel dangerous also made them invisible to pursuit. They drove for 2 hours before Harlow finally said, "We should stop. The horses need rest." They pulled off the road into a grove of mesquite trees and sat in the darkness listening. No sound of pursuit, no hoofbeats, nothing but the whisper of wind through dry branches and the occasional call of a night bird. "How did Ashford know we'd be at Fort Grant?" Willa asked. "He didn't," Harlow said, "but there are only 2 routes to Tucson, the canyon road we took or the main road through Grant. He probably has men watching both, and one of them is a federal deputy." "Appears so." Elena felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. Ashford's reach was longer than she'd realized. His corruption ran deeper. A badge was supposed to mean something, supposed to represent law and order and justice. But in Victor Ashford's Arizona, badges were just another commodity to be bought and sold. "We keep going," she said quietly. "All night if we have to. We don't stop until we reach Tucson." "That's another 70 miles, Harlow said, "and the horses will make it. They have to." They rested for an hour, then they pressed on through the darkness, moving slowly but steadily eastward. The stars wheeled overhead. The temperature dropped. Elena's hands went numb on the reins, but she didn't stop. Somewhere behind them, Colton Reed and whoever else Ashford had sent would be searching, organizing, planning their next move. But every mile they traveled was a mile closer to safety. A mile closer to the moment when this evidence would be in the hands of someone who couldn't be bought. Marshal Tobias Crane, the name had appeared in Nate's journal, a former Texas Ranger, a man who'd sent more than 20 corrupt officials to federal prison over his 15-year career. A man Victor Ashford hadn't been able to touch. If they could reach him, everything would change. Dawn found them at the San Pedro River, crossing a shallow ford where the water ran clear over smooth stones. The horses drank gratefully while Elena splashed water on her face and tried to massage feeling back into her hands. "How far?" Willa asked. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, dark circles under her eyes. 40 miles, Harlow said. "Maybe less. Can we make it today? If we push hard?" They pushed hard. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace. Sweat soaked through Elena's dress. The wagon wheels kicked up dust that coated everything with a fine red powder. But she kept the horses moving, kept her eyes on the road ahead, kept counting down the miles. 35 miles. 30, 25. At noon, they saw riders on the horizon, 7 of them coming fast from the south. Not again, Willa whispered. But these riders wore blue cavalry uniforms, and as they drew closer, Elena could see the lieutenant's bars on the lead rider's shoulders. They weren't Ashford's men, they were an escort. The lieutenant reined up alongside the wagon. He was young, maybe 25, with a sunburned face and serious eyes. Mrs. Thorne, Judge Harlow. Yes, Elena said. Lieutenant James Morrison, 2nd Cavalry. Marshal Crane sent us to meet you. He got word from Fort Grant that there might be trouble. There is trouble, Harlow said. A man claiming to be a deputy marshal named Colton Reed has been following us. We have reason to believe he's working for Victor Ashford. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. Crane mentioned Ashford, said if we saw anyone trying to stop you, we were to consider it interference with a federal investigation and act accordingly. Meaning we escort you to Tucson, and anyone who tries to prevent that gets arrested or shot if they insist. For the first time in 3 days, Elena felt something loosen in her chest, something that might have been hope. Thank you, Lieutenant. They rode the rest of the way with cavalry, before and behind them a moving fortress of federal authority that even Victor Ashford's money couldn't breach. The miles fell away, 20, 15, 10, and then shimmering in the afternoon heat, the buildings of Tucson appeared. They'd made it. Against all odds, through ambush and pursuit and 3 days of running, they'd made it. The federal building was a 2-story adobe structure on Main Street with an American flag hanging limp in the still air. Lieutenant Morrison led them around to the rear entrance, where a tall man with iron gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades under hard sun stood waiting. Marshal Tobias Crane. He looked exactly like Elena had imagined, hard, competent, absolutely incorruptible. Mrs. Thorne, he said. Judge Harlow, let's get that wagon unloaded and those crates into my office. It took an hour to move all 8 crates upstairs and arrange them in the large room that served as Crane's office. When the last one was in place, the marshal closed the door and turned to face them. All right, he said, show me what you've got. Elena opened the first crate, then the second, then the third. She watched Crane's face as he read through the documents, watched his expression shift from professional interest to grim focus to something that might have been anger. When he reached the crate with the skulls, he stood there in silence for a long moment. Jesus Christ, he said finally. This is everything, deeds, letters, financial records, bodies. He looked at Elena. You realize what you're sitting on here. This isn't just murder. This is organized corruption reaching into the territorial government. Hell, it might reach all the way to Washington. I know, Elena said. That's why I brought it to you. Crane nodded slowly. I'm going to need a few days to go through all of this, catalog it properly, build a case that can't be challenged or dismissed, and I'm going to need you to stay in Tucson as a witness. We'll stay as long as necessary. Good, because Victor Ashford is going to fight this with everything he has, and everything includes a lot of money, a lot of influence, and apparently at least one man with a federal badge. Colton Reed, Harlow said, claims to be a deputy marshal. Crane's face darkened. Reed, yeah, I know him. He was a deputy for about 6 months, until I fired him for taking bribes. If he's still carrying a badge, it's a fake. And if he's working for Ashford, he's about to wish he'd stayed wherever he's been hiding. The marshal moved to his desk and pulled out a map of Arizona territory. I'm going to send telegrams to every federal officer between here and Red Rock, put out a warrant for Reed and anyone working with him, and I'm going to request a federal judge from Santa Fe to preside over the trial. Someone Ashford hasn't had time to buy. How long will that take? Elena asked. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Can you wait that long? We've waited this long. Crane studied her for a moment. Your husband must have been a brave man, Mrs. Thorne, to go up against Ashford alone. He was, but he's dead because of it. Then let's make sure he didn't die for nothing. They spent the rest of the afternoon going through the evidence with Crane explaining how each piece connected to the others, building the narrative of 8 years of corruption and murder. By the time the sun set, Crane had filled 3 notebooks with notes and cross-references. I'm putting you up at the Grand Hotel, he said, federal expense, and I'm assigning 2 deputies to watch your rooms, just in case Ashford gets desperate. You think he'll try something here in Tucson? I think a man who's killed 7 people won't hesitate to kill 3 more if he thinks it'll save him from the gallows. So, yes, Mrs. Thorne, I think you should be very, very careful. The Grand Hotel lived up to its name, real beds with clean sheets, a dining room that served hot meals, windows with actual glass and curtains. After 3 days of sleeping on the ground and eating cold food, it felt like paradise. Elena made sure Willa was settled and stood at the window looking out at Tucson's gaslit streets. Somewhere to the west, 120 miles away, Victor Ashford was probably learning that his evidence had reached the federal marshal, learning that the widow he tried to intimidate had escaped his reach. She wondered what he was thinking, what he was planning. But mostly she thought about Nate, about how he'd started this journey alone, knowing the danger, knowing what it might cost him. He died before seeing it through, but she hadn't. She'd carried his work across the desert and through ambush and into the hands of justice, and now, finally, the law would do what the law was supposed to do. It would hold powerful men accountable. Behind her, Willa stirred in her sleep, murmuring something that might have been her father's name. Elena turned from the window and sat beside her daughter's bed, smoothing the hair back from her forehead the way she'd done 1,000 times before. We did it, she whispered. Your father found the truth, and we brought it home. Outside, the night deepened, but inside, for the first time since Nate's death, Elena Thorne allowed herself to believe that everything might actually be all right, that justice might actually be possible. That morning would come, and with it the reckoning Victor Ashford had spent 8 years trying to avoid. The telegram arrived on the morning of the 4th day. Elena was having breakfast with Willa in the hotel dining room when one of Crane's deputies appeared at their table, his face tight with concern. Mrs. Thorne, the marshal needs to see you right away. The federal building felt different than it had 3 days ago. Then it had been a refuge. Now, with armed deputies stationed at every door and Crane's office packed with federal officers she didn't recognize, it felt like a fortress preparing for siege. Crane stood at his desk, a telegram crumpled in his fist. When he saw Elena, his expression was grim. Victor Ashford didn't run, he said without preamble. I thought he might, thought he'd take what money he could carry and disappear into Mexico or California, but he didn't. What did he do? He sent 50 armed men to Tucson. They rode in this morning and took rooms at every hotel and boarding house in town, including the Grand. Elena's blood went cold. Willa is safe. I've got 6 deputies with her right now, and she's being moved to a secure location. But Mrs. Thorne, we have a problem. He spread a map across his desk. Ashford's men have positioned themselves at every road out of town, the stage depot, the telegraph office. They're not trying to hide it. They want us to know they're here. What about the cavalry from Fort Lowell? On their way, but they won't arrive until tomorrow. Until then, we're outnumbered and outgunned. Judge Harlow, who'd been standing by the window, turned to face them. He's going to try to take the evidence, tonight probably, before reinforcements arrive. Crane nodded. That's my assessment too. Then we move it, Elena said, like hide it somewhere he won't think to look. He'll have men watching this building. They'll see us move it. Not if we're clever. Elena's mind raced, sorting through possibilities. The crates are distinctive, but what if we split up the documents, hide them in different locations throughout Tucson? Even if Ashford's men raid one location, they won't get everything. Crane considered this. It could work, but we'd need trustworthy people Ashford hasn't bought. The church, Harlow said. Father Domenico at San Agustin. He's been here 30 years and he hates corruption worse than sin. The newspaper, Elaina added. The Tucson Citizen. If we give them copies of some documents for safekeeping, they'll also publish the story. Make it public before Ashford can stop it. Crane's expression shifted from grim to something that might have been approval. All right, we do it your way, but we do it fast. I want everything moved before nightfall. They worked through the afternoon with the focused intensity of people who understood exactly what failure would cost. The documents were sorted, copied when possible, and distributed to 7 different locations throughout Tucson. The church, the newspaper, the courthouse, the homes of 3 federal officers, and one said the most damning evidence stayed with Crane himself. By sunset, the 8 crates sat empty in Crane's office. If Ashford's men came for them now, they'd find nothing but wood and iron bands. Where's Willa? Elena asked when the last document had been moved. The Fort Commander's house at Fort Lowell, safest place in the territory. She's got 6 troopers guarding her and orders not to open the door for anyone except me or you. I want to see her. Not tonight, the roads are being watched. Tomorrow, after the cavalry arrives, I'll take you myself. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist, but she knew Crane was right. Trying to reach Fort Lowell tonight would only lead Ashford's men straight to her daughter. So she waited. In a room at the federal building with deputies stationed outside the door and a loaded pistol on the table beside her bed, she waited. Sleep didn't come. She lay in the darkness listening to the sounds of Tucson at night, footsteps in the street, voices. Once the sharp crack of a gunshot followed by shouting. Then silence. Somewhere in this town, Victor Ashford was planning his move. Somewhere, his hired killers were watching and waiting for their chance. But they wouldn't get it. Not tonight, not ever. The attack came at 3 in the morning. Elena woke to the sound of breaking glass and shouting. She grabbed the Colt and moved to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. Gunfire, multiple weapons, the heavy boom of shotguns and the sharp reports of pistols. Then Crane's voice, loud and commanding. Federal building, you're surrounded, throw down your weapons. More gunfire, someone screamed. Elena's hands tightened on the pistol. Every instinct screamed at her to throw open the door and help. But Crane had been explicit. Stay in the room. No matter what you hear, stay in the room. The fight lasted 10 minutes. It felt like hours. When silence finally fell, Elena counted to 100 before cracking the door open. The hallway was a shambles. Bullet holes pocked the walls, blood stained the floorboards. 3 bodies lay sprawled in positions that told their own stories of violence. Crane stood near the stairs, reloading his pistol with methodical calm. When he saw Elena, he nodded. It's over. They tried to rush the building. We were ready. How many? 12 of them. 4 dead, 6 wounded, 2 ran. None of them got past the first floor. And the evidence untouched. Like I said, Mrs. Thorne, we were ready. But the attack changed everything. By sunrise, word had spread through Tucson. Victor Ashford's men had assaulted a federal building, had tried to kill a U.S. Marshal and destroy evidence in a federal investigation. The cavalry arrived from Fort Lowell at noon, 40 troopers in full uniform led by a captain who took one look at the bullet-scarred federal building and issued orders that turned Tucson into an occupied town. Checkpoints at every major intersection, patrols on every street, a curfew from sunset to sunrise, and arrest warrants for every man who'd ridden into Tucson with Victor Ashford. Most of them were rounded up by evening. Some surrendered quietly, others tried to fight and died in the streets they'd thought to terrorize. By nightfall, 23 of Ashford's 50 men were in custody or dead. The rest had scattered into the desert, running for the border or the mountains or anywhere that wasn't Tucson. But Victor Ashford himself was nowhere to be found. He's not in town, Crane said that evening, standing in his office with Elena and Harlow. We've searched every hotel, every boarding house, every building where he might be hiding. He's gone. Back to Red Rock, Harlow suggested. Maybe, or maybe he's running. Either way, I've sent telegrams to every marshal and sheriff's office within 200 miles. His description, orders to arrest on site. What about the trial? Elena asked. We proceed without him if necessary. Judge Warren is arriving from Santa Fe tomorrow. I've sent him summaries of the evidence and witness statements. He's prepared to convene a grand jury immediately. Can you try a man who isn't present? Not for murder, but we can issue an indictment, make him a fugitive, and when we catch him, and we will catch him, he'll face every charge we can prove. Elena thought about the 7 men in Nate's journal, about the 3 skulls in the cave, about the 63 families who'd lost their land to Ashford's schemes. I want to testify, she said. Crane nodded. I was counting on it. The grand jury convened 3 days later in the federal courthouse, an imposing building of stone and mortar that had witnessed a decade of territorial justice. Judge Warren presided, a silver-haired man in his 60s with the bearing of someone who'd spent his life weighing evidence and rendering judgment. The courtroom was packed. Reporters from newspapers across the territory, citizens of Tucson who had heard the stories and wanted to see justice with their own eyes. And in the front row, Willa flanked by 2 deputies. Elena sat in the witness chair and told her story. All of it. From the moment Nate died to the cave in the canyon to the night ride through the desert. She spoke clearly, calmly, letting the facts carry their own weight. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Then the prosecutor, a federal attorney named Benjamin Lockhart, began presenting the documents, one by one. Deed after forged deed, letter after incriminating letter, financial records that showed millions of dollars stolen from depositors and funneled into illegal mining operations. It took 3 days to present it all. On the 4th day, Judge Harlow testified, then Marshal Crane, then the cavalry lieutenant who'd escorted them to Tucson, then the officers who'd cataloged the evidence. And on the 5th day, when everyone expected the prosecution to rest, the courtroom doors opened and a young man walked in. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, and carried himself with the careful control of someone balancing on a knife's edge. When he took the stand and stated his name, for the record a murmur ran through the crowd. Garrett Ashford, son of Colonel Victor Ashford. Elena's heart hammered. She'd never met Garrett Ashford, had never even known Victor had a son, but here he was, sworn and seated about to testify in a federal investigation of his own father. Lockhart approached the witness stand. Mr. Ashford, thank you for coming forward. I know this can't be easy. It's not. Garrett's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. But it's necessary. How long have you known about your father's activities? I've suspected for 3 years. I've known for certain for 6 months. And why didn't you come forward sooner? Garrett's jaw tightened. Because he's my father. Because I wanted to believe there was an explanation that didn't make him a monster. Because I was a coward. You're here now. That takes courage. No, courage would have been coming forward when Nathan Thorne was still alive, when I might have prevented his death. This is just me trying to live with myself. Lockhart paused, letting that statement settle. Then he withdrew a document from his case. Do you recognize this letter? Garrett looked at it and closed his eyes. Yes, my father sent it to me 6 months ago. When I told him I was concerned about the number of foreclosures his bank was processing. Can you read it for the court? Garrett's hand shook as he took the letter. His voice, when he spoke, was barely audible. Dear Garrett, I understand your concerns, but you must understand that business in the territories requires a certain flexibility in approach. The men whose land we've acquired were obstacles to progress. Nathaniel Thorne was becoming a similar obstacle. Sheriff Dawson will handle it as he's handled previous situations. The matter will be resolved cleanly and without complications. Trust that I know what I'm doing. Your father. The courtroom erupted. Judge Warren hammered his gavel for order, but the damage was done. In one letter, Victor Ashford had confessed to ordering Nate's murder. Mr. Ashford, Lockhart said quietly, "Why did you keep this letter?" "Because I knew it might be needed. As evidence." Garrett looked at Elena for the first time. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thorne. I should have done this sooner. I should have stopped him. I'm sorry." Elena met his eyes and saw the same thing she'd seen in her own mirror for weeks. Guilt, grief, the terrible knowledge that you could have done something and didn't. She nodded slowly. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement. Garrett had chosen to do the right thing even when it cost him everything. That meant something. The grand jury deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman read the indictment. 23 counts, 7 of murder in the first degree, 63 counts of fraud, multiple counts of theft, bribery, and conspiracy, and 1 count of operating an illegal mining operation on federal land. If convicted on all counts, Victor Ashford would hang. The only problem was that Victor Ashford was still missing. 1 week became 2, then 3. Marshals searched across Arizona territory and into New Mexico. They questioned associates, threatened accomplices, followed every lead that might point to Ashford's location. Nothing. It was as if the colonel had vanished into the desert itself. Elena stayed in Tucson waiting. The Grand Hotel became a kind of home. Willa enrolled in the local school. Harlow rented a small house near the courthouse and began helping Crane organize the evidence for the eventual trial. And Elena visited Nate's grave every morning, the one they'd moved to Tucson's cemetery so she wouldn't have to return to Red Rock. "We're closer," she told him. "The indictment is signed, the evidence is preserved. All we need is to find Ashford himself." But as the week stretched into a month, she began to wonder if they ever would. Then on a Tuesday morning in November, a rancher rode into Tucson with news. He'd found a camp in the mountains east of town, one man living rough using a false name. But the rancher had served in the cavalry during the war, and he recognized the colonel when he saw one, even one trying to look like a prospector. Marshal Crane assembled a team within an hour, 12 deputies, 20 cavalry troopers, and Elena, because she'd insisted and Crane had finally agreed that she'd earned the right to be there. They rode east into mountains still dusted with early snow, following the ranch's directions. The camp was hidden in a narrow canyon, a single tent beside a dying fire, and sitting on a log staring at the flames was Victor Ashford. He didn't run when the cavalry surrounded him, didn't reach for a weapon. He just sat there looking older than Elena remembered, thinner, defeated. "Mrs. Thorne," he said when she dismounted, "I underestimated you. You murdered my husband." "Yes, I did." His voice was flat, empty of emotion. "And 6 others before him, and I'd do it again if it meant keeping what I built. What you stole." "Semantics," he smiled without humor. "But it doesn't matter now, does it? You've won. The evidence is secured. My operation is destroyed. My reputation is ruined. You've taken everything from me." "Good," Elena said quietly. Crane stepped forward and pulled Ashford to his feet, snapping iron shackles around his wrists. "Victor Ashford, you are under arrest for 7 counts of murder, 63 counts of fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct federal justice. You will be transported to Tucson to stand trial. Do you understand these charges?" "I understand that I should have killed you when I had the chance," Ashford said, looking at Elena. "Before you found the cave, before you reached Tucson, I had a dozen opportunities, but I thought you were just a widow, just a woman who'd give up when things got hard." "Then you don't know much about women," Elena said. They brought Ashford back to Tucson in chains, riding in a wagon, surrounded by armed cavalry. Word spread fast. By the time they reached town, hundreds of people lined the streets to watch. Some cheered, some jeered, most just stared in silence at the man who terrorized the territory for 8 years. The trial began 2 weeks later. Federal Judge Warren presided. Benjamin Lockhart prosecuted with the methodical precision of a man who'd built an unbreakable case. Ashford's defense attorneys, 3 of them hired with the last of his liquid assets, did what they could. But there was no defending against the mountain of evidence, no explaining away the letters, the forged deeds, the skulls in the cave, and there was no denying Garrett Ashford's testimony. The trial lasted 7 days. Elena testified on the second day, walking the jury through everything she'd found and everything she'd endured to bring it to light. On the 4th day, the prosecution displayed the 3 skulls now identified through dental records and personal effects as Samuel Crawford, Henry Walsh, and Robert Jensen. On the 6th day, Garrett read his father's letter aloud once more. This time Victor Ashford was in the courtroom to hear it. His face showed nothing, no remorse, no shame, just the cold calculation of a man realizing he'd lost. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and faced Judge Warren. On the charge of murdering Samuel Crawford, how do you find guilty? On the charge of murdering Henry Walsh, guilty. On the charge of murdering Robert Jensen, guilty. 7 times the word guilty echoed through the courtroom. 7 murders, 7 lives Victor Ashford had taken in his pursuit of wealth and power, plus 63 counts of fraud, guilty on all counts. Judge Warren sentenced him to death by hanging, execution to take place in 60 days. Victor Ashford stood to hear his sentence without expression. When it was done, he looked at Elena one last time. Your husband died in seconds, he said, clean and quick, more mercy than you're showing me. My husband died because he wanted justice, Elena replied. You're dying because justice caught up to you. There's a difference. They led him away in chains. Elena watched him go and felt nothing, not satisfaction, not triumph, just a deep, weary relief that it was finally over. The 60 days passed slowly. The territory began the process of sorting out Ashford's empire. The bank was seized by federal authorities. The mining operation was shut down and the equipment auctioned. The stolen land was returned to its rightful owners or to their widows or to their children. 63 families got their property back, got their lives back. And on a cold morning in January, Victor Ashford climbed the steps to the gallows in Tucson's public square. Elena didn't attend, neither did Willa. They stayed at the hotel holding hands, waiting for it to be done. When Crane came to tell them it was finished, Elena nodded once and stood. I need to visit Nate's grave, she said. They walked together, the 3 of them, and Flynn through Tucson streets to the cemetery on the hill. The grave was marked with a simple stone that read Nathaniel Thorne, 1853 to 1891. Beloved husband and father, he sought the truth. Elena knelt and placed fresh flowers on the grave. It's done, she said quietly, and Ashford is dead. The families have their land back. The territory is starting to heal. You started this and I finished it. She stayed there for a long time, one hand on the cold stone, remembering the man who'd given her 10 good years and a daughter and a reason to be brave when bravery seemed impossible. Finally, Willa touched her shoulder. Mama, we should go. Elena stood. Yes, we should. They walked back to town together, and for the first time since Nate's death, Elena allowed herself to think about the future. What came next, she didn't know, but she knew she was strong enough to face it. 6 months later, Elena stood in a small office on Tucson's main street, looking at a sign being hung above the door. Thorne Legal Defense Fund, established 1892. It had been Harlow's idea, but Elena had embraced it immediately. Too many people in the territory had no access to justice. No one to help them understand the law or defend their rights. The fund would change that. Free legal advice, help with land disputes, assistance navigating the complex web of territorial and federal regulations. Harlow would run it officially. He had the legal experience and the reputation. But Elena would be there every day, learning, helping, making sure that what happened to the 63 families never happened again. Willa had other plans. At 15, she'd announced her intention to study law, to become the first woman attorney in Arizona Territory and probably the first woman attorney in several territories. Someone has to make sure people like Ashford can't do this again, she'd said. Might as well be me. Elena had no doubt she'd succeed. Garrett Ashford had changed his name to Garrett Harlow, adopting the judge's surname with permission, and was working as a clerk in the federal courthouse. He'd never be an attorney. His father's crimes made that impossible, but he was trying to make amends the only way he knew how, by helping the system that had brought his father down. As for Elena herself, she'd bought a small house in Tucson with the settlement money from Ashford's estate. Nothing fancy, just a place where she and Willa could build a new life. The ranch in Red Rock had been sold. Too many memories, too much pain. She'd taken what mattered, Nate's journals, his Colt 45, some photographs, and left the rest behind. Now standing in the spring sunshine with Flint at her feet and Willa at her side, she watched workers hang the sign and felt something she hadn't felt in over a year. Peace. Not happiness exactly. The wound of Nate's death was still too fresh for that. But peace. The knowledge that she'd done what needed doing, that justice had been served, that 7 dead men could rest easy knowing their killer had faced judgment. Mrs. Thorne. She turned to find Marshall Crane approaching a letter in his hand. This just arrived from the territorial governor. Elena took the letter and read it, then read it again, not quite believing what she was seeing. The governor was creating a new position, territorial ombudsman for land rights, someone to investigate complaints, mediate disputes, and ensure that what Victor Ashford had done couldn't happen again, and he was offering the position to Elena. It comes with a salary, Crane said, and full authority to investigate any land transaction in the territory. You'd be answerable only to the governor and the federal government. I'm not a lawyer. No, but you understand injustice, and you've proven you won't back down from powerful people. Crane smiled slightly. Besides, Harlow will be your legal advisor. You'll have all the expertise you need. Elena looked at Willa, who was grinning. You should do it, Mama. You'd be amazing. I don't know the first thing about being an ombudsman. You didn't know the first thing about being a detective either, Willa pointed out. You figured it out. She had, hadn't she? She'd taken her grief and her fear and her stubborn refusal to accept injustice, and she'd brought down an empire. Maybe she could do this too. I'll need to think about it, Elena said. Of course. The governor said there's no rush, but Mrs. Thorne, Crane's expression grew serious. The territory needs people like you, people who can't be bought or scared off, people who care more about justice than comfort. After he left, Elena stood in the doorway of her new office, the letter in her hand, and thought about everything that had happened since that day in the cemetery when Victor Ashford had handed her a foreclosure notice. She'd lost her husband, lost her home, nearly lost her daughter. But she'd also discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed, a capacity for courage that surprised even her. And she'd learned something that Nate had always known, but she'd never fully understood until now. Justice wasn't something handed down from above by judges and lawmen. It was something ordinary people had to fight for every day, in every small choice to do what was right instead of what was easy. Nate had fought for it, and it had cost him his life. But his fight hadn't been in vain. 7 killers brought to justice, 63 families restored, a territory beginning to heal from years of corruption. That was Nate's legacy, and now it was hers to protect and build upon. Elena folded the letter and put it in her pocket. She'd give the governor her answer tomorrow, but she already knew what it would be. Yes. She'd take the position. She'd investigate complaints and mediate disputes and make sure that widows and orphans and ordinary people had someone on their side when powerful interests tried to crush them. She'd do it because Nate had shown her how. And she'd do it because Willa was watching, learning that women could be more than wives and mothers. They could be defenders of justice, champions of the weak, forces for change. That night, Elena returned to Nate's grave one last time. The setting sun turned the cemetery golden, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled. She knelt by the headstone and placed her hand on the carved letters of his name. I'm going to keep fighting, she told him, not just for you, for everyone, for all the people who can't fight for themselves. I'm going to make sure your death meant something. Every single day for the rest of my life, I'm going to make it mean something. The wind whispered through the grass. Somewhere a dove called, and Elena Thorne, widow mother, and soon to be territorial ombudsman, stood and walked back toward town, toward the future, toward all the work still waiting to be done. Behind her, the sun set over the Arizona mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. A new day would come tomorrow, and she would be ready for it.